To those of you here today, hello and welcome to our panel discussion, Inclusion for Climate Progress. This panel event is part of the Oxford HR Knowledge Festival, where we hope to stimulate meaningful and important discussion within the for-purpose sector, and we hope to make this a quarterly or biannual event. Thank you for joining us. Whether you're listening live or on record, we're really delighted to have you here. Do check out the other sessions coming up and any recordings by visiting the Oxford HR website. My name is Zoe Greenwood and I'm the Practice Area Lead for Environment and Climate at Oxford HR, and I'm hosting our discussion today. I'm joined by 4 wonderful panel guests, each with their own perspectives on inclusion for climate, and I'm also supported behind the scenes by Ruth Davis. Together, we will explore what inclusion means in the context of climate and environmental action, how leaders and organisations can bring different people into the conversation, and the benefit of an inclusive approach to tackling the climate crisis. We have 60 minutes together. Towards the end, we will take questions from you, the audience, so we're very keen to include you. Please do use the Q&A box on your screens at any time to post a question, and we will hear from a few people at the end. Ruth will be able to unmute you so you can ask your questions directly. A brief note, if I may, on our title before we get started. We are aware that climate change is interconnected with many other sustainability and development related issues and is not a lone wolf. Today, we are treating the notion of climate progress as something that is inherently positive. Inclusion also is a large topic, and we bring to it today perspectives from personal experience. We are not seeking to represent everyone or to present a worldview. So with that, I am really thrilled to welcome our panel guests today. In alphabetical order, let me introduce them. Binyam Gebreyes is a researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. He works closely with the Least Developed Countries Group at the UN climate negotiations, helping to ensure their concerns regarding adaptation are reflected throughout the process. Binyam is an environmental law expert and national climate change negotiator. Wonderful to have you here, Binyam. Thank you. Catriona Corfield is the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at the Woodland Trust, a UK-based organisation all about unleashing the power of trees to fight the climate and nature crisis. She is also chair of the Wildlife and Countryside's Link cross-sector equality, diversity and inclusion group who grow the confidence and competence of leaders to be more inclusive. Welcome, Catriona. Sarah Roberts is the Interim Chief Executive for Practical Action, an international development organisation that helps people to find solutions to some of the world's toughest problems, made worse by climate change and gender inequality. Before joining Practical Action as a director, Sarah was Executive Director of the Ethical Tea Partnership. Hello, Sarah. And last but not least, Shweta Bahri. Shweta is co-founder of Earth Warriors, an organisation established in the midst of the pandemic that provides a climate change curriculum to parents and teachers to engage children as young as 3. And I can personally vouch for the fact that kids love it. Mine certainly did. She's also the founder of No More Waste, a platform that promotes sustainable solutions for individuals and businesses in India. And before becoming an entrepreneur, Shweta worked on education policy for ARC Education Partnerships Group and Oxford Policy Management. Thank you for being here, Shweta. So with that, let's dive into our discussion. Now, we know there are deeply rooted inequalities when it comes to climate change. Those most affected are the least responsible. And in this space, there are many voices that are considered to be experts, while others are more marginalised. At the same time, we're at a turning point in human history whereby climate change is happening now and the world is waking up to it in quite a significant way. We're interested in the topic of inclusion because, quite simply, this is something that affects everyone, but not everyone is aware of the ramifications and not everyone feels empowered to be part of the change. So let me start with what is a very simple discussion point to put to our panel, but one that is perhaps more complex to answer. In your opinions, panel members, what does inclusion for climate progress mean? And perhaps you can bring it to life with some examples. Shweta, can I come to you first?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Zoe, for the lovely introduction, firstly, and inviting me to be part of this lovely panel discussion. I think this is a great question. I mean, I guess we've been talking about being inclusive in all aspects of policy development. And I think talking about being inclusive in the climate movement moving forward is a really, really important discussion to have. Because like you rightly said, it's the groups that are affected the most by climate change that are often least represented in the process. In fact, one of the groups that I was going to touch on were the countries in the global south, so to say, the least developed countries that probably contribute the least to climate change, but actually end up getting impacted the most. And it's great to see the work that Binyam is doing, representing those countries, making sure that they're part of the policy dialogue. So I think that is one big group that really needs to be part of the climate dialogue, building solutions that work not just for the developed world, but also for the developing world, because the contexts are so different. And then for me, as the co-founder of Earth Warriors, my passion really is, and I have been working in education policy my entire career, and I really believe that a group that is underrepresented in the entire climate policy discussion, but is actually one of the most active, are school activists, right? Children who are, led by Greta Thunberg and many other amazing teenage young activists, as young as like 8, 9, who are actively campaigning for climate action and actively campaigning for climate education. And sadly, not a lot of them get heard when it comes to the policy making process. You see some really brave children calling out politicians, calling them out for action, and yet people do listen to them, right? But are they actually heard when it comes to policy decision making? I'm not really sure. And I think this has been one of their pet peeves. I mean, they've been demanding climate education consistently for the last 5 years or so, but Italy is the only country in the world that has actually made climate change part of its national curriculum. No other country has actively responded to this demand. So how inclusive are we really being? And through our work, we really believe that children need to be empowered with the knowledge and the tools they need to combat the challenges that we are going to face and that they are going to face as a generation that we haven't. And especially targeting kids in their early years. Like Zoe, you know this because we did this with your children as well, which was so great. But actually, when you catch kids young, you teach them sustainable habits at an age that come as naturally to them as brushing their teeth. And they are very much from their everyday life an inclusive part of climate action. And I really think that we need more governments, more schools, more parents to start including children in their climate action and give them the resources and tools they need. And I don't just say this because I run Earth Warriors, but I generally believe whether you use Earth Warriors or you use another curriculum, I think this is really, really important. And then last but not least at all, I think women need to be an integral part of the climate change conversation. Just because of the gender disparity that already exists in the world, women are extremely vulnerable to climate change. They feel the effects of climate change and disasters that happen a lot more. And they need to be made an integral part of that conversation. But I'm sure the other panelists have a lot more to say about that. So I'll keep quiet now.
Thank you, Shweta. And your passion for this subject is just kind of radiates out of the computer. So, thank you. Who would like to build on that? Perhaps Binyam, maybe we could come to you. Shweta mentioned the least developed countries. This is an area that you work on day in, day out, and I'm sure are very passionate about as well.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you very much first for the invitation. Very pleased to be part of this panel. I know Sarah was part of IIED, so I look up to you and how I grow into the space, and supporting LDCs is part of not just part of a job, but something I really do out of passion. My experience is mostly around international climate negotiation and a bit on climate action. So I'll speak towards that. Inclusion for me takes different forms at different levels, whether it's the climate talks at the UN or it's the national climate planning, implementation, local or grassroots level. It can take different forms. But whatever the form, I believe inclusive process creates opportunity to address not just climate change, but also socioeconomic inequalities. Issues around inequity would be addressed through inclusive processes. Uh, it's really important to have an inclusive process in climate change because it will help us reduce long-term vulnerabilities and it helps us promote equal opportunity for men and women. I won't be going into things discussed already, but it brings out the balance that we don't usually see. But today I want to discuss kind of a different perspective. Um, yes, there are lots of benefits within the inclusive process, but it's not simple as we speak. Inclusive process will, personally, I believe it would first divide us before it brings us to harmony. So we can say inclusive process is critical, but we cannot say it's easy. It's actually very difficult and full of challenges, and the space, as it accommodates more minds, brings long-term reward instead of next day success. So I think we have to look at the long-term reward and benefit we get from inclusive process because at a short term, it actually brings more questions. Let me kind of explain this a bit more on a practical term. Now, the climate change, or in general, the environmental management inclusive space was not as inclusive as it is now. It actually, climate change was considered as response of the rich or a luxurious action after countries have developed instead of showing the vulnerability of the poor. So as the space started to open up, uh, different questions started to surface, like what are we doing here? What's the objective? How do we cope with the impact? What can we do to stop the increase? How can we mitigate? How can we adapt? And there were also some uncomfortable but critical questions around who is responsible for all this. How should we address respective responsibilities? And this, along with many other questions, were brought up in the discussion as the space became more inclusive. So this created, for instance, the developed developing country dichotomy. 20 plus years of negotiation, we're still discussing questions about as the space becomes more inclusive. We are far from reaching the ideal inclusiveness, but I believe the convention, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement are the fruits of an open space. And the more this opens up, I think we get to address, we get to come to a better harmony. At the national level, inclusive process is even more important. At the top level governance, if we look at the climate change planning and implementation, the need to bring relevant sectors and wider governments and non-government organizations, both vertically and horizontally, is really critical. I believe that's one of the reasons why we see opposing priorities in governments, for instance, in their national plans. Ministry of Industry, if not consulting, the Ministry of Environment tends to put industrialization at all means, and Ministry of Environment will make sure they put barriers for that in the name of protecting the environment. So through inclusive process, I believe we can create a balance around sustainable development, because questions like how do we ensure local communities and grassroots levels not only contribute to the national planning process but also own it? How do we bring more actors into the game? How do we bring state and non-state actors into partnership so that they could think as one? These are questions that would move us from our comfort zone. But if we don't face this challenge now, we will inevitably face them sometimes. But that would ultimately bring us to harmony when we have an inclusive process. So questions are never ending, and as the space opens and becomes more inclusive, one question after the other, the polarities would be more visible. But when we are looking for not becoming just the same, but harmonized, I think over time we get response to the questions, which would ultimately bring us harmony. So yeah, that's kind of my view on this one. Sorry for taking much of your time.
Not at all, Binyam. I'm really kind of struck by your comment about actually this is uncomfortable before it's harmonious, and you know, it kind of speaks, I think, to the complexity of something that sounds simple but isn't. And I'd like to come back to that in a bit. First of all, let's hear from others. Sarah, you know, your whole career you've worked with communities and different geographies. I'm sure some of these things are resonating for you as well. And what's your view on what climate progress means?
Oh, very much so. And it's nice to come in after Shweta and Binyam, because I was just introducing myself to Binyam virtually, because my first ever job was at IIED. So I'm always excited when I see somebody sitting in an IIED space doing this work. So I guess I wanted to kind of link what I was going to say to what Shweta and Binyam was saying, because at Practical Action, you know, our mission is to change the systems so that people can lift themselves out of poverty, and the communities that we've been working with for 50 years are those who are most vulnerable to climate change. So part of what we do, and again, I see this in work that we do with IIED as well, is all about making sure the realities of people at the sharp end of climate change, the realities they're facing, are well understood. And then get into the policy discussions so that the policy and the finance flows in ways that work for them. And so we work on this in many different levels. We work on getting that message out. So, you know, for the last couple of years, we've run some big campaigns called Turning the Tables on Climate Change, where we've been, 2 years ago, we focused on Sudan, the realities for people in Sudan. This year, we've been focusing on Nepal. And I mean, just to give some examples, you know, we planned this campaign just before the pandemic struck. And then, of course, you know, our communications team couldn't travel. So we had to find new innovative ways of working with local journalists to get into the remote communities where women in particular are really, really facing the burden. Men are migrating, agriculture is less productive, they're more at risk of all sorts of disasters, and getting that reality out. So our teams then did a whole campaign on all sorts of social media, but on radio stations, just to get those voices out to a mass audience. And I was just asking for some statistics before I came on, and I think this one that we've just run had a reach of 13 million. So I think that's fundamental, because I think sometimes we forget, or people who are thinking about climate change are so focused on electric vehicles or, you know, that kind of infrastructure change. They're not thinking about what it means for people who are at risk of flooding or landslips in the countries where we work. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is to get those voices into the negotiations, as Binyam's talking about, to get them into the policy discussions, to get them into the financial flow discussions. So we do that again in all sorts of ways. Lord Oates, one of the politicians who's the climate change rep for the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords, talked to us about making sure that we could link him into, so he could have discussions with communities in Africa and take that into the work that he's doing. So we try and facilitate those kind of discussions. And then we're doing a lot of work in terms of getting people from different countries into the negotiation teams, getting a seat at the table. Binyam was talking about the fact I think there's a big focus on adaptation, trying to make sure that the money is going to adaptation as well as mitigation. And we're also having a big focus at Practical Action on trying to get people to focus more on issues around loss and damage. So communities who are facing irreversible impacts of climate change. It's not just about mitigation, it's not about adaptation, it's about how do you provide support for people whose lives are going to be changed already, and need that support now. And I think one final point from me, which is a different kind of work we do. We have a consultancy arm at Practical Action that does work with businesses, with development banks, with UN agencies. And one of the things we try and do is make sure that their work is really inclusive as well. So we've got a methodology called Missing Voices, which found ways of really getting testimony from people, again, the most vulnerable people, so older women, younger women, single-headed houses, transgender people, disabled people. What is the reality of people who are facing catastrophic flooding from climate change? And how are the support services that are supposed to help them operating for people within a community that's vulnerable already, for those most vulnerable people within it? And it affects people in very different ways. And we've had a really good approach that got real information from people you don't normally hear of. That methodology has now been picked up by UN Women. It's where we're doing work on, the Asian Development Bank is using it as they plan programs. We did some training with Care International recently. They're using it and approaches they're taking. And I think that's fundamental as well, that people that you hardly ever hear from, who are really the most vulnerable people, are included in policy making and approaches and support services. And that's something that we think is very important for the future. That's a big part of inclusion for us.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd certainly like to come back to that piece about the vulnerable. Catriona, let me come to you next. I know you're coming at this from more of an organisational perspective, but very much organisations that are in the sector, and obviously that kind of UK-based perspective as well. What does it mean for you from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, kind of echo everything that's already been said by all my colleagues on this panel. But that thing you said right at the beginning of kind of the inequalities, who the people who are least responsible for those inequalities being most affected by, and that plays out at UK level as well. As you say, kind of Woodland Trust is a UK based organisation, but all the kind of inequalities that exist in UK society, they're kind of echoed in this kind of in the environmental kind of debate, and those voices are least heard because they're least represented in organisations, and the people who, for example, Woodland Trust is all about trees and woods, but the people who have the least access and the least proximity to trees and woods, which is something that impacts climate, but also more proximate things like air quality, like mental health, like physical health. The people who have the least access, least proximity, are the people who have been least responsible, in society for fueling those problems in the first place. So, my view on inclusion is, organisations have that responsibility to look at their own, their own systems, their own processes, going back to kind of what Binyam said about, process and it being kind of long term. You have to look at your systems, you have to look at your processes, your ways of working, because they've been set up to, by the people who are part of the organisation and who those favoured. So you have to look at, doing things in a different way that brings, those, I think I loved Sarah's kind of example, missing voices. I would call it, in my world, I would call that equality analysis, and looking at different groups of people and how they're affected, but bringing that in. And I think, the other the other kind of element of my work and my kind of perspective on inclusion here is, you know, what role does an organisation like the Woodland Trust have in terms of kind of mitigating for climate? So, you know, we obviously trees have a great kind of benefit in mitigating for the impact of climate, and we have great kind of initiatives like schools, you know, tree packs for schools and communities, but they need to kind of reach all communities. We can't just have those skill packs, you know, sitting on a shelf and they'll be, you know, they'll be utilised by those communities who are already, you know, least impacted by climate change. So, you know, for example, we're working with Black to Nature, which is a, you know, a Bristol-based ethnic minority-led organisation to, you know, to bring trees to their, you know, working with in Birmingham with Birmingham Trees for Life, you know, to bring the trees into the city there so that it's, you know, it's a more kind of equitable thing. You know, another thing, we've got an emergency tree fund, so working with local councils. Local councils have got their kind of emergency, you know, they're declared a climate emergency but haven't got the tools and the equipment to respond to that climate emergency. So, you know, helping those councils out in those areas like, you know, Edinburgh or Glasgow or the Black Country, you know, areas where there's, you know, this imbalance in those populations as well, and bringing trees to, you know, to those urban areas and those kind of deprived areas and people who are most kind of impacted by climate change in the UK context as well.
Thank you, Catriona. I think you're all working in such different ways, but such important ways in terms of inclusion for climate. I'm interested also in kind of what the critical components are to actually make it work, rather than being something that's a good intention. I think, you know, we've had some examples already of that, but is there anything anyone would like to add in terms of, you know, how do you do inclusion properly in this space? What are some of the lessons that you've learned? What are the things you've noticed?
I think I'd go back to Binyam's point about it's not overnight. You can't expect it to happen. You know, you have to be committed to it long term, and you have to realise that, you know, you can't just expect things to go from here to there overnight. You know, it's a longer term way of doing things, and you know, it's not quick. So, you know, I think that would be the key lesson that I would say to anyone.
Other thoughts, Sarah?
Well, and I think you have to have people working who really understand the people whose voices you're trying to include or get represented. So the reason, you know, the way we had to do our missing voices methodology is we had to work with people who were really, really trusted by the community and by those groups. And for people who were particularly marginalized, you know, we had to pilot new approaches of interviewing people and, you know, using phones rather than visiting people in their homes, not drawing attention to people if there was a real stigma involved in talking about the challenges they were facing. So you have to find the right way of involving people in the conversation, otherwise you're not getting real information. And it takes a lot of effort because, I mean, even gender, I mean, you know, we've talked about how climate change disproportionately impacts on women. That's absolutely true, but even, you know, it disproportionately impacts on different kinds of women in different ways. So you know, there's layers below that as well. So you need to understand the communities you're working with. You need to have the right people engaging in the right way and with a level of trust. But then organisations like ours, I think, if we do it well, can get those voices amplified and get them into the policy discussions, and therefore get change that works at that higher level, I hope, for people who need it most. I think that's what we're all trying to do in our different ways.
Shweta, just yes, go on. I was going to come to you anyway, so that's great.
I do good. I just actually wanted to build on what both Sarah and Catriona said, actually. So I think exactly what, you know, Sarah was saying about, you know, finding the right people and the right way of working. I don't think we don't need to underestimate as well, like any group in terms of their ability to participate in the dialogue and discussion as well. So obviously, because I'm passionate about education, I'll go back to like your children's example. But if you choose to teach children in the right way, you know, like the big argument for not having children included, especially children in their early years as part of climate education, is that it induces way too much anxiety. But if you can phrase the conversation and you work hard at making sure this is done in a much more positive, solutions focused way, it is extremely possible. So I think like really working with people who understand and finding innovative ways to address the problem and bring people into the discussion, I think is really, really key. And I think second, the point Catriona made about actually getting resources to people who need them as well. So there are some movements that happen. For example, like in India, there was a movement a couple of decades ago actually called the Chipko movement. I don't know how many of you are aware, but it was actually a movement that was led by a group of women who wanted to protect their local forests. And, you know, it was a group of women that got mobilized and they went and hugged the trees, which is literally what Chipko means. And that small movement by women garnered so much international attention. Like those trees were saved. And it's something that inspires people all over the world, even today. So I think like getting resources and getting media action to like movements like that really matter, it has been shown that it makes a difference. And I think that's one of the things we really need. And we can really harness the power of social media and other things when it comes to that. Like how do we highlight small, you know, citizen-led examples like that have the potential to make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shweta. Thank you, all of you, for that. Binyam, from the perspective you're coming at this from, well, you know, what are the critical components that make climate progress, climate inclusion work?
Yeah, I think I have to agree with what has already been said. I think bringing more people, the right people, and the relevant people into the space is I think a critical component, because that's where we get the different perspective. That's where we truly understand the challenge. It won't just be a literature review, but it's an actual experience shared by someone who has passed through or is passing through the challenge. So getting that perspective is invaluable. So it's really important to open up the space to bring in those people and listen, and not just listen but respond to. One of a very good example that I would like to raise is the LDC Vision 2050, which is now championed by Bhutan, which is the current chair of the LDC group within the UN climate talks. This 2050 vision is kind of a response to the climate challenge, long-term vision for 2050, aiming to ensure that no country is left behind, and it aims to be guided by the principles of inclusion, participation, justice, equity, and this is really interesting coming from LDC countries. And for me, this sends a very big message. One, LDCs are taking a leadership in climate action. And as Shweta earlier said, these are the most vulnerable countries who contribute the least to the climate impact. So their interest is very clear. It's for strong motivation and push for climate ambition. So for me, if I could sum this up, it says if LDCs with all the challenge could make a bold commitment and action, how much can the others who are in a position to do so deliver? So I think there are some promising results, but this needs to be backed by sufficient finance, sufficient support from developed countries.
Thank you. So it's a slow process, and the one that requires attention and listening, but one that needs to happen. As you're listening to our panel guests, the audience out there, do feel free to post questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom window there, and we will come to your questions towards the end of our hour together. But do post them now. I don't wish to dwell on the barriers too much here, but you know, I think it's fair to say that not everyone is engaged in an inclusive approach. Everyone who's involved in the climate agenda. So how can organizations and leaders, in your view, kind of bring more people into the conversation? Are there any perspectives on that? Catriona, I'd like to come to you first, because this is really your area. You spent most of your career trying to encourage organizations in this space to be more inclusive. What advice do you have?
Yeah. So, you know, I think one thing that leaders need to do is really be open to challenge, because, you know, too often I hear people say, oh, you know, they value diversity, they value inclusion, but actually when they're presented with a fresh idea, you know, a different way of doing things, they go, well, you know, that's not what I meant, that's not what I wanted to do. So, you know, so one of the things that I'm involved with right now through Wildlife and Countryside Link, working together across the environment sector to kind of understand our own inclusive behaviours, how they you know, our leaders' own perspectives on their inclusive behaviours, and also how that's felt by people within those organisations, to really measure what we need to change. And it might be things like, you know, being more open to challenge and being more open to you know, different perspectives that, you know, I can't second guess what it'll be like, but yeah, getting an understanding of you know, where we are and what we need to change, I think will really help us move forward. So
Other thoughts on that? Sarah?
Well, I think that there's different ways of bringing people into the conversation, and I think, you know, one of the things we do a lot across our teams is try and bring people from different countries directly into, you know, COP negotiations, for example. And we've done that in all sorts of ways. You know, sometimes we've had people from our communications team in Sudan, for example, attending COP. Sometimes we've had people from our teams joining national delegations. So obviously that's from their countries, but, you know, because, you know, our staff are very, very embedded in communities, they're able to bring a different approach into those national delegations. And I also think the power of storytelling is really, you know, really important. And that's something we do a lot of. I know it's something that IIED does a lot of. I was just looking at some, you know, really innovative things that they've done around some of their animations to get across A, the realities, and B, what needs to change. And I thought that was really brilliant, actually. I hadn't seen that until very recently. And I think that moves people in a different way, because you're trying to get people to respond to the realities of people that they don't necessarily have much engagement with or much understanding with. But that power of telling a story in ways that people can relate to, I think can go quite a long way.
Thank you, Sarah. Binyam, you're nodding. Is that resonating for you?
Yes, that's actually an interesting point raised by Sarah. I agree with all of them. It's as simple as funding participants to attend these meetings does play a huge role. The UN funds only 2 or 3 people per country in LDCs to cover, I think, more than 70 agenda items within the negotiation only. And most of them run parallelly, so the expectation is that 2-3 number delegation is expected to cover all this. So covering the attendance and presence is really important. But outside this climate negotiation, bringing the presence in different climate talks would really will raise the profile. And we have been working to support this, to do a bit of funding participants to attend these climate negotiations, and we've been prioritizing women because they are the least to be picked in the national delegation. So we prioritize women and we bring them to show their potential. That it's not about gender; it's about potential, and we've been trying to kind of explain through action instead of telling that women are capable. We're trying to bring them to the forefront and say, look at this, and we've got some excellent negotiators now. And Another point I would like to raise is organizations, and more particularly leaders, if they could play a role by through a coordinated and more coherent process amongst themselves. It really helps make an impact at a larger scale and reach more people. And often organizations have the capacity to bring in private sector, government, civil society together. So I think that's a space that we need to explore. We have to utilize our capacity as organizations to bring in different actors and create better coherence for action. And finally, one kind of a reminder for us as organizations is that vulnerable countries and communities are not testing grounds for ideas, concepts. Our support needs to be locally and nationally driven and owned, meaning our objective should really be not to keep reinventing the wheel, but to strengthen domestic institutions, their structures, their governance, so that they can manage and cope with the climate risk.
Binyam, thank you. I was really struck by two things you said there, explaining through action, and vulnerable communities are not testing grounds for ideas. Really powerful stuff. Shweta, you have your own organisation, so what does that look like for you in terms of the responsibility of organisations and leaders to kind of lead on inclusion for climate progress? How does that sit with you, being the entrepreneur that you are?
Yeah, well, I suppose, Kea and my co-founder and I, we're both Indian and have I've grown up in India, but also personally lived in the UK and worked in lots of different countries across the world. And Kea has had the same kind of diverse experience. So for both of us, it's an integral part of the mission and the values of our organization. One of the big things that we, for example, have done is made our curriculum, for example, accessible at a very accessible price point and designed in a way that can be implemented a lot more contextually. Even if you look at, for example, the way we've written our curriculum and the characters that we've used, even in that, we've actually tried to make it all a lot more gender diverse, completely neutral in terms of, and a lot of diversity in terms of people from different parts of the world. So I think in all aspects organizationally, we are quite mindful of the role that we can play and kind of the women entrepreneurs, what we are representing, and the change we're trying to bring. And I think what I'd like to say more, not so much related organizationally, but to the point that I think Binyam and Catriona were making, was that one, I think organizations don't just need to say that they are being inclusive, they actually need to believe it and demonstrate it. And I can personally vouch for this, having grown up in India, worked in the UK, worked for the global organization, there's a lot of difference between what is said and then what is actually done. And I'm so pleased to hear that, Sarah was talking about how her organization makes sure that, different people from different countries are brought into the delegation. So I think that's key. And then second, I think, what Binyam said about vulnerable communities not being testing grounds, I think there is a huge need for empathy on both sides. I think, countries that, and people from countries that, are more developed need to be more empathetic to the fact that it's not so easy, for LDCs and communities to, work on the development agenda and the climate agenda. But at the same time, being in India and listening to some of the arguments that I've heard politicians here make, you also can't, give up responsibility for climate change by saying, oh, developed countries have developed, we need to have, our time. And I think there needs to be a lot more empathy and nuance in the argument on both sides. And I really strongly believe that. Yeah, thank you.
You're reminding me, Shweta, of one of my favorite authors, Roman Krasnaric, who talks about the need for more empathy in climate change generally, and our understanding of how people are affected by it. He also has a fantastic book called The Good Ancestor, which quite hauntingly talks about how we are colonizing the future through our pollution activities today, which I think reinforces the need to work with young children as you are doing, the closest we can get to the next generation. I'm going to turn in a moment to questions that are coming in from our panel. Just before we do that, I do feel the need to ask this question. I think we've touched on it, but this year is really branded the year of climate action, with COP26 happening in Glasgow in November, coming up very soon. It was cancelled last year because it could not be face-to-face, and that wasn't considered fair. But of course, this year we may be equally challenged by the politics of the pandemic, let's say. This is perhaps a question more for Sarah and Binyam, but please, anybody do chip in. What needs to happen for COP26 to be inclusive? Can it be inclusive? You know, any kind of live thoughts on that as we career towards November would be very welcome. Binyam, do you want to start us off?
Sure, but Sarah, if you want to go first, happy to.
Go for it, Binyam.
Great. I think hosting COP is not an easy task. It's not just about having the tents and hotels ready for hosting 50,000 people, but the presidency in itself, it needs a huge commitment and a huge global leadership skill, and I believe UK is one of the countries that's capable to deliver. But with COVID and a lot of other challenges, I think things are getting more and more challenging, and UK is in a very difficult position right now. We're thinking about inclusiveness, but also climate action is needed. We've postponed it for 1 year, and hopefully with the vaccine, at least there's a bit of hope that there will be an in-person meeting. But as I said earlier, inclusiveness raises a lot of questions, and now we're talking about vaccines and the equity about vaccines. And okay, if UK is fully vaccinated, or developed countries are fully vaccinated, how about developing countries? How will they get the vaccination if the scramble keeps going on like it is right now? And okay, if we get to manage and vaccinate government officials and negotiators, then what about the youth attendance, the organizations, the local community participants that play a huge role in getting that big success of climate change conferences? So there are still a lot of questions. Now, many people might say, why don't we just go virtual? But it's not as simple as just having it on a Zoom call. Sometimes you take days to agree on one single vocabulary on what it means, and having that on Zoom call is quite challenging. And in some LDC countries, internet is still expensive. Even after paying that much amount, the bandwidth is not even strong to accommodate that level of engagement. So with all this, I think we're yet to see the full magnitude of the impact of COVID. But we're seeing the bit of the impact, and it could possibly further marginalize the poor. So to be honest, I don't have any answer about how this could be inclusive. But yeah, an in-person dialogue is really critical to get the decision, but also there needs to be some work done virtually beforehand in preparation for COP.
Yeah, as you say, not an easy task at all, and the world will certainly be watching, I think, this year to see how that plays out. Sarah, did you want to add, or Catriona or Shweta at this point on that one?
I'm aware that you probably want a bit of time for questions.
That's fine. No, please. Go if you want to.
I mean, just very briefly, I think like everything, we're all trying to navigate this strange world, and there's pros and cons, aren't there, of doing more virtually. And I am aware of some very interesting things that are happening in the preparation that have been virtual, that have been more possible because they're virtual. So you can get 40 finance ministers coming on a Zoom call in a way that they wouldn't all fly in for those preparatory meetings. So there's some things that can be helpful, and actually, because people aren't traveling, you know, gets a bit more of an equal playing field between different countries. And as Binyam says, there's some things that deepen inequality. So no easy answers, and I think we're all just seeing how we can get the best possible balance as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you to all of you for that. Turning our attention to the questions from the panel, the questions in the Q&A box. There is one about coronavirus. There's also a question from Susie, who's had a note that she'd like me to ask the question for her. Do you have any advice on how to engage your audience on what's a very noisy and saturated topic, and how to stand out, which is an interesting one. So climate change for Susie, feeling like something that's noisy and saturated, how do you stand out? Who would like to take that one? Where should we go first? Shweta, could we come to you?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I'm not sure exactly. I agree that it is definitely a noisy space. I think there's a lot of information that is flying around out there. And I think if, you know, you personally want to take climate action, I think you sometimes don't know where to get accurate information from. And I'm not a communications expert, but I think I would just say that if I've learned anything through Earth Warriors and No More Waste and my work, is that you should really know your audience if you're trying to get your message out, for example. So whoever your audience is, or whoever your target group is, or whatever message you're trying to get out, like, I think really be clear on that, and then also really do your research to back it up. Because one of the most annoying things I find about the internet and social media is that you have all of these claims flying around and no way to back it up. So I think if you really want to stand out from the noise, know your audience and really do your research before making that. And don't guilt trip people into doing things. I think one of the biggest problems with communication at the moment is, like, you know, there's a lot of guilt tripping going on in terms of, like, you must do this and you must do this. And a lot of this stuff is just not possible for everyone. Like, it's not possible for everybody to be vegan. It's not even accessible for everyone. So I think, like, just again, being empathetic in that messaging, being clear on your message and really doing your research can help a lot.
Mm-hmm. Catriona, do you have thoughts on that one? I mean, a lot of your work is about connecting, you know, let's say different vulnerable groups, particularly in the UK, to nature, in the hope that that then inspires kind of a deeper connection to the natural world, and therefore a kind of motivation, if you like, to act on climate change. So I can imagine kind of trying to gauge audiences in what feels like a noisy topic feels a pertinent one to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just look at this panel. We're all different organisations playing different parts in the climate kind of sphere, and I think that's also key, kind of knowing what you offer, where you add value, because, you know, if we're not collaborative as organisations as well, and knowing where we add most value, then that's just going to add to the noise. That's just going to make it, you know, so, you know, we're very clear that we're going to avoid trees and woods, and that being, you know, how we can make a difference in terms of climate and in terms of environment there. But yeah, no, I would totally agree with everything Shweta says though as well.
Thank you. There's a question here as well about whether we see or believe that coronavirus is going to affect or hinder you know, inclusion efforts. I think we've touched on that certainly in terms of COP26, but yeah, I think this is probably our kind of final question. So any reflections on that one from anybody?
I would so I would say that it kind of opens up some opportunities, because, you know, organizations have been kind of working in a very place-based thing, which can, you know, can limit how they operate, and if you're less place-based, you know, that can be, obviously, you know, as other people have said, it can present some challenges, but it can also bring forward some opportunities in terms of how people work. You know, if they can't be in that place where you know you would traditionally see them, then that opens up kind of all sorts of opportunities in the workplace and in terms of how people can engage with you. So I think there's opportunities there.
Those new methods of engagement becoming a lot more normalized, I think, now, aren't they? As what was normal a year ago is not anymore, those kind of embedded habits. And other thoughts from others on that one? Coronavirus helping or hindering our efforts to take climate action and be inclusive along the way? Sarah?
Well, I think I'm always trying to be hopeful. So there's that feeling that coronavirus has made people think about things in a different way, and it has accelerated. I mean, what's been positive is we've tended to see the focus on climate change stay very strong, even though we've got all the challenges of coronavirus again. There's all sorts of ways actually that we can be much more inclusive because we've all been learning and adapting from coronavirus. The thing I think is we have to continue to be very intentional about it, because we actually have the opportunity perhaps to do it more and to do it differently, but it's probably easy not to as well. So I think listening to my colleagues focus on leadership and I think the intentionality, always thinking about how we can get more people or more different voices in the room. It's much easier to do that than it ever has been, but we have to keep being very thoughtful about it and pushing that through in all the forums we're at. And maybe just one thing to add from the previous point. I love the point that Catriona made about just thinking about, but building on Shweta's thing about audiences. Where do we add value? Where putting our voice out on our own is important, and where do we join in coalitions? And I think, particularly this year, there is so much power in good coalitions of bringing different voices together. And I think lots of us will be working in many different coalitions, and I would really encourage that as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Any final thoughts before we close today? Well, then I would like to say, as we come to our final couple of minutes of our 60 minutes, hasn't that firstly flown by? Because it's been so interesting to listen to all of your points. Particularly taking away with me, I think, notes about actually inclusion can be uncomfortable and can be messy before it is harmonious, and that's okay. As well as a really key message coming through from everyone about empathy and being thoughtful, and understanding different perspectives. And we're all very, very clear that this is an issue that affects people in very different ways and in an unfair ways. And I am personally very grateful for the work that all of you and all of your organisations do in terms of the taking climate action. So thank you for that. And also thank you for the time you've given us today. You're busy people, and you've been very generous with your time. Joining a panel event doesn't just take the hour, it takes the time in advance. So thank you. Thank you also for our audience. It's not as fun without you, even though we can't see you, we know that you're there. And apologies for any questions that we didn't get to. So do join us again. Do follow Oxford HR on social media and on the website to find out about further panel discussions. This one, as well as the one yesterday and the one tomorrow, will be available on record, so you can watch them back.